June 1, 1944. A low, grey sky pressed down over northern France as distant thunder rolled across the horizon, except it wasn't thunder, it was artillery, echoing through the mist like a funeral drumbeat for a nation that didn't yet know it was dying. In the German command post near Saint-Germain, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt stood over a table littered with maps, his fingertips brushing the cold metal edges of measuring tools while the ground trembled faintly beneath his boots. The invasion he had spent years preparing for was coming, and he knew with a clarity that felt like cold steel. Germany could not stop it. For weeks, intelligence reports had grown darker, heavier, more suffocating. Thousands of Allied ships massing in British harbours, endless bomber streams pounding railways and bridges into dust, supplies flowing into England at a rate Germany could no longer dream of matching. Von Rundstedt had studied wars his entire life, and nothing he saw resembled a delayable threat. It resembled finality. Private couriers and adjutants hurried back and forth, their leather soles scraping across the concrete floor, the smell of sweat, ink, and damp uniforms filling the air. Radios crackled like nervous insects. Rumors spread, paratroopers, landings, explosions along the coast. The invasion had begun. Von Rundstedt felt none of Hitler's confidence, none of the ridiculous bravado being broadcast from Berlin. He felt only the crushing weight of arithmetic of divisions they no longer had. Tanks they could no longer replace, aircraft they could no longer fuel. His war was fought with facts, not fantasies. 5 days later, on June 6th, Operation Overlord crashed onto the beaches of Normandy. A roar like the sky, tearing apart, thundered as naval guns unloaded shells the size of small cars. Beaches that had been quiet fishing grounds hours earlier turned into landscapes of churned sand, burning vehicles, and shattered concrete bunkers. The Luftwaffe barely appeared. Fuel shortages had grounded most of the remaining fighter squadrons. German infantry, brave but outnumbered and overwhelmed, fought from flooded trenches and collapsing strong points, unable to stem the tide of hundreds of thousands of Allied troops. Reports came in thick and fast. Losses mounting, units disintegrating, communications severed. Allied armor pushing inland faster than German reserves could arrive. Von Rundstedt listened in silence, jaw tight, the muscles in his face twitching each time another battalion vanished from the map. It was only June 10th when he first said the words aloud to Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel on the telephone. "Make peace, you fools. Make peace?" Keitel gasped. It was the closest thing to blasphemy a German officer could utter. But von Rundstedt wasn't trying to provoke. He was stating a fact. The war was lost. Germany could not fight the Western Allies and the Soviet Union at the same time. Every path forward led only to destruction. Keitel dismissed him. Hitler dismissed him. Everyone dismissed him. Still, von Rundstedt repeated his warnings, growing more blunt each time. The front cannot be held. The troops are exhausted. The enemy's superiority is overwhelming. It did not matter. Berlin lived in a different world, a world built from Hitler's fantasies. Then came July 1st, 1944. The air outside the headquarters was hot and heavy with the smell of cordite and distant burning villages carried by the wind. Von Rundstedt's dismissal letter arrived via courier, crisp and official, without a trace of gratitude or acknowledgement of his decades of service. To Hitler, he had committed the greatest sin. He had spoken the truth. He packed slowly, folding his uniform with the precision of a man who had spent his entire life mastering order in a world sliding toward chaos. No farewell ceremony. No salute from the staff, just silence and the steady, merciless rumble of the advancing Allied guns. His replacement, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, arrived that afternoon, his boots still dusty from the Eastern Front. He looked around at the dim room, the exhausted staff, the maps covered in enemy arrows pushing inward like claws. In von Rundstedt's eyes, he saw something he had never expected from the legendary commander: resignation. Not cowardice, clarity. Von Rundstedt left the headquarters quietly, stepping into a car that would take him away from the front he knew would collapse within weeks. As the vehicle rolled down the gravel road, he looked out across the fields of Normandy, where smoke drifted like low clouds and distant artillery flashed like heat lightning. He knew he was witnessing the beginning of the end. By then, rumors of disasters were already circulating through the Wehrmacht. Hitler was firing commanders almost weekly, replacing experience with obedience. Reality was an enemy Berlin refused to confront. As von Rundstedt's car disappeared from sight, an officer watched from the window whispered he was the only one willing to say it. But Germany was no longer a place where truth mattered. And just 19 days later, on July 20th, the earthquake came an explosion, not on the battlefield, but inside Hitler's own headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. Word spread rapidly across Europe. A bomb had detonated near the Führer. Hitler might be dead. For von Rundstedt, now at home and far from power, the news arrived silently through radio waves carrying shock and tremor. For a brief moment, Germany teetered on the edge of a new future, one where reason might finally break through the madness. But Hitler lived. The oak table had shielded him. The conspirators miscalculated, and the regime reacted with pure, unrestrained fury. The Gestapo swept through Germany like a plague. Thousands were arrested: officers, clerks, civilians, anyone suspected of hesitation, let alone defiance. Torture chambers filled. Execution rooms worked day and night. No one was safe. Not even the most decorated generals. When reports of the arrests reached von Rundstedt, he understood immediately truth had just become more dangerous than ever. And the war he had said was lost on July 1st, now entered its darkest, bloodiest, most hopeless phase. The failure of the July 20th plot unleashed something feral inside the regime, a rage so sweeping that even veteran officers understood the rules of survival had changed. In Berlin, the Gestapo interrogated suspects under chandeliers that flickered from the force of distant Allied bombs. In field headquarters across France, dawn executions became as common as morning briefings. The message was unmistakable. Loyalty was no longer enough. Only unquestioning obedience would be tolerated. One of the names whispered among the accused was Erwin Rommel. To the world, he was the desert fox, brilliant, daring, beloved even by many enemies. To Hitler, he had once been a shining symbol of German invincibility. But admiration curdles quickly in a dictator's mind when defeat enters the picture. Rommel had disagreed with Hitler repeatedly, urging defensive strategy rather than the fanatical stand-and-die commands broadcast from Berlin. He had warned that the Luftwaffe was too weak, panzer divisions too few, and Allied supplies too overwhelming to repel a massive invasion. After the bomb plot, even suspicion was enough to seal a man's fate. At Rommel's home in Herlingen, the atmosphere had turned cold and brittle. Allied fighters had strafed his car days earlier, leaving him wounded and unfit for service. Now he spent his days resting in an armchair by the window, one hand pressed to his bandaged head, staring out across orchards shimmering in the summer heat. His wife Lucy noticed the change: first the silent visits from officers, the sudden shift in conversations, the letters that stopped arriving. On October 14, 1944, 2 black cars rolled up to their home. The engines ticked softly after shutting off, the sound hauntingly similar to a clock counting down. Generals Bergdorf and Maisel stepped out, their uniforms immaculate, their expressions carved from stone. They were men who delivered only 2 kinds of news: medals or death. Rommel understood immediately. He rose slowly, pain tightening his jaw, and asked for a few minutes with his family. In the quiet living room, sunlight filtered through lace curtains, catching the dust motes drifting in the air. He embraced his wife. He placed a hand on his son Manfred's shoulder. He said the words fathers never want to say, but sometimes must. Then he stepped outside. The car door closed with a heavy final thud. Minutes later, Rommel drank the cyanide capsule that would kill him before he reached the nearby woods. He was 52. Germany announced he had died from wounds sustained on the front. A hero's funeral followed. Those who knew the truth said nothing. In Hitler's Germany, silence was often the last form of loyalty and the last act of survival. Von Rundstedt watched the news with a heavy stillness. If Rommel, the Golden Commander, could be erased so easily, then no one was safe. Not even those who had already been dismissed, already removed from power. The message was clear. The regime would kill its own legends before admitting reality. Meanwhile, the Allied advance accelerated with a force that felt like nature itself had chosen a side. On July 25th, Operation Cobra burst out of the hedgerows near Saint-Lô. The bombers came first waves of American aircraft, filling the sky like a metal storm. Their bombs rolled across the countryside in thunderous sheets, flattening entire landscapes and punching a hole straight through the German front. Von Kluge watched in horror as unit after unit disintegrated. Tanks burned in fields, their ammunition cooking off like fireworks. Survivors staggered down roads with blackened faces, their nerves shattered. The front was not bending, it was collapsing. By early August, German forces were being squeezed toward Falaise. The battlefield became a slaughterhouse, columns of smoke, shattered vehicles, dead horses burning, fuel and soldiers cut down as they tried desperately to escape the tightening noose. Over 50,000 German troops were killed or captured. The 7th Army ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. Von Kluge, haunted by the inevitability von Rundstedt had foreseen, made a desperate attempt to communicate with Hitler. But Hitler interpreted hesitation as treason. Accusations flew, trust broke. On August 19th, the field marshal pulled his own car to the side of the road near Metz and swallowed poison. He died alone. 2 giants of the German military had fallen in 1 month, one to assassination by his own government, the other by despair. Their deaths reinforced a lesson everyone already understood, but no one dared say aloud. Truth was lethal in Hitler's Germany. Yet amid the implosion, the war ground on. Paris fell on August 25th. Civilians flooded the streets waving flags, weeping, embracing Allied soldiers as church bells rang for the first time in years. In Berlin, Hitler raged. His voice grew hoarser. His decisions grew more erratic. He dismissed reality like a stubborn child refusing to come inside from the rain. But rain cannot be dismissed, and neither could the Red Army. While the Western Allies pushed toward the Rhine, the Soviets shattered what remained of Army Group Center. Operation Bagration swept across Eastern Europe with terrifying speed hundreds of miles in weeks. Town after town fell. Entire German divisions vanished from the map. Soldiers fought till ammunition ran dry, then fled, then froze, then died in forests no one would remember. Every telegram from the East sounded the same. Collapse. Meanwhile, inside the Third Reich, starvation, fear, and fatigue tightened their grip. Cities burned night after night. Berliners slept in basements that shook like tin boxes under the weight of Allied bombs. Factories lay in ruins. Trains ground to a halt. Civilians carried water in buckets through streets still warm from the last firestorm. Still, Hitler refused to negotiate, refused to consider retreat, refused to allow any commander the flexibility to save his own men. He continued issuing orders as if commanding divisions that no longer existed. Aircraft that could no longer fly, fuel that could no longer be refined. The war had become a kind of ritual suicide, slow, agonizing, unavoidable. Amid this catastrophe, something almost unbelievable happened. Hitler reinstated von Rundstedt. In September 1944, Army Group West was dying bleeding out across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. The Wehrmacht needed a figure of authority, someone whose presence alone could hold the frayed edges of command together. Many generals were dead, others were imprisoned, some were disgraced. Some were simply broken. Von Rundstedt, aging, weary, still recovering from illness, answered the summons. He returned not because he believed victory was possible. He returned because the German army, those exhausted, frost-bitten, mud-caked men who had marched and fought and died for years, needed leadership. Even in defeat, someone had to preside over the wreckage. Someone had to maintain order amid collapse. When he arrived at headquarters, staff officers stood at attention, but the atmosphere was thick with unspoken truth. They all knew the war was lost. They all knew Hitler's orders were increasingly delusional, yet they worked, they planned, they fought, because stopping was unthinkable and disobedience was fatal. Von Rundstedt took command with a calm solemnity. He told his closest officers privately, "I am here to oversee a catastrophe." Nothing more. Outside, Allied artillery shook the ground. Inside, his words shook the last illusions. The Ardennes lay silent in the early December morning, an eerie calm before the storm. Snow had dusted the hills, white and peaceful, masking the chaos that was about to erupt. Hitler's plan was audacious, almost mythic in its audacity. The Ardennes offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, was to punch a hole through the thin American lines, cross the Meuse, and strike Antwerp. It was a gamble of desperation, a last chance for glory in a war already lost. Von Rundstedt had opposed it from the beginning. He understood the limitations of men, tanks, and fuel. He knew the terrain, the weather, the logistics, and he knew the gamble could not succeed. But Hitler's will was absolute, and dissent was lethal. On December 16, 1944, German forces moved. 30 divisions, a final collection of Germany's operational reserves, advanced silently, their engines muffled in the snow. For a few fleeting days, they achieved near-complete surprise. American units, convinced Germany was finished, were caught off guard. Entire battalions were overrun, and pockets of resistance collapsed under coordinated artillery and armored assaults. Villages that had not seen battle in years became instant battlefields. The world watched as the front line bent but did not break. Von Rundstedt's predictions unfolded with merciless precision. The offensive quickly encountered the immutable constraints of reality. Tanks ran out of fuel on snow-clogged roads, their engines cold and useless. Columns of soldiers, exhausted and underfed, became easy prey for Allied aircraft once the clouds parted. Local successes could not be exploited because there was nothing to exploit them with. The offensive was a fragile, temporary illusion. The deeper the Germans pushed, the more vulnerable they became. At Bastogne, a key junction in the American defense, a regiment of paratroopers held with stubborn ferocity. Von Rundstedt had warned that these points could not be bypassed. Hitler dismissed it. The delay shattered the timing of the offensive. German soldiers moved like ghosts across snowfields, yet the momentum they had gained in those first days evaporated under relentless air attack and logistical collapse. By late December, the weather cleared and the skies opened. Allied bombers descended in waves, transforming roads into graveyards and tanks into scorched hulks. The bulge in the line, the ostensible success, began to shrink. By January 1945, the offensive had completely stalled. German forces were forced to retreat to their starting positions, having expended nearly 100,000 men and over 800 tanks. Resources that might have sustained the defense for weeks were gone. Victory had been impossible, and the gamble had accelerated Germany's defeat. Yet the fighting did not cease. Orders continued to flow from Berlin, disconnected from reality. Units were told to hold impossible positions, to resist endlessly, to die where they stood. Von Rundstedt executed these orders with grim professionalism, managing a doomed defense with as much dignity as he could muster. Meanwhile, on the Eastern Front, the Soviets advanced with terrifying speed. Army Group Center had already been shattered. The remnants of Army Group North and Army Group South were being ground down. Each telegram from the East described annihilation, villages burned, soldiers encircled, cities falling. Hitler's fantasy of a negotiated stalemate evaporated into smoke and blood. The Reich was collapsing on all fronts, yet the men at the top refused to acknowledge it. By March 1945, von Rundstedt faced dismissal once again. The Americans had crossed the Rhine at Remagen on March 7th, capturing a vital bridge intact. This event, a strategic miracle for the Allies, provided Hitler with a convenient scapegoat. Von Rundstedt, senior commander and symbol of the Western Army, was blamed for failing to destroy the bridge. He had no responsibility for the decision, no hand in its execution, yet responsibility fell upon him. Once more, the master of defeat was cast aside. He returned home to his family, an old man of 69, his body weakened by heart problems and the relentless stress of decades of command. Von Rundstedt had seen the war for what it was. He had understood, as few in the German high command did, that continued resistance only multiplied destruction. Every strategy, every order, every human life lost after July 1944 had been avoidable if reality had been acknowledged. Yet he had been powerless against the machinery of a regime that punished truth and rewarded delusion. He had watched brilliant men, honest men, die either at the hands of their own government or under the hammer of relentless Allied advance because they had spoken the truth. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. Hitler had shot himself in his Berlin bunker on April 30th. A man consumed by delusion until the very end. The Reich, which had promised a 1,000-year empire, lasted just over 12 years. Europe lay in ruins, 40 million dead, cities flattened, economies shattered, societies irrevocably transformed. The Holocaust left a wound in human history that could never heal. Von Rundstedt, captured briefly by American forces, was treated with the courtesy due his rank and age. His health, however, was failing, and questions of war crimes would hover over him for years. In January 1949, the British considered prosecuting him for war crimes related to the Commando Order, which had led to the execution of captured Allied soldiers, but von Rundstedt's health was too fragile. The charges were eventually dropped. He returned to civilian life, retiring quietly near Celle in Lower Saxony. He avoided public attention, granting occasional interviews to historians. He refused to publish memoirs or offer self-justification. His perspective was analytical, measured, often blunt, but never propagandistic. Von Rundstedt died on February 24, 1953 at 77. His burial was simple, with military honors. More than 2,000 mourners attended, yet the grave itself was understated, a stone marking only his name, rank, and dates. It told nothing of the brilliance, the failures, the foresight, or the moral complexity of the man who had commanded armies in 3 wars. Historians continue to debate von Rundstedt's legacy. Some argue he was complicit, an enabler of a criminal regime whose professionalism facilitated atrocities. Others see him as the tragic embodiment of the professional soldier trapped within a morally bankrupt system, capable of insight but powerless to act decisively. Perhaps both interpretations contain truth. Perhaps von Rundstedt was at once a realist, a craftsman of war, a reluctant enabler, and a moral observer. What remains indisputable is that he saw the inevitable collapse of Germany earlier than almost anyone. On July 25, 1944, He understood the war was irretrievably lost. He predicted the futility of further fighting, the destruction of men and material, the annihilation of cities and lives. He warned repeatedly, only to be dismissed, removed, or silenced. Every act of German resistance after that date, every futile offensive, every suicidal defense confirmed his judgment. Von Rundstedt's story is more than a chronicle of a general's final years. It is a lens into how organizations fail when truth is punished. In Nazi Germany, honest assessments were considered treachery. Bad news was suppressed, delayed, softened. Commanders who spoke plainly were removed. Decisions were made based on fantasies rather than facts, with catastrophic consequences. Corporations, governments, militaries, and institutions throughout history have repeated this pattern. The short-term comfort of conformity breeds long-term disaster. Von Rundstedt's enduring words, "End the war, you idiots," resonate far beyond the trenches of Normandy or the snow of the Ardennes. They are a lesson in the human cost of ignoring reality, a warning about the dangers of leaders surrounded by yes-men, a reflection on the tragedy of knowing the truth but lacking the power to act. They are a reminder that when honesty is punished and truth is silenced, destruction is inevitable and often incomprehensible until it is too late. His voice, once drowned by the roar of artillery and the silence of obedience, now echoes through history. The fools did not end the war. They continued fighting, presiding over the destruction of their own country, sending hundreds of thousands to die in battles that could not be won for objectives that could not be achieved. And through it all, von Rundstedt's eyes had seen clearly, his mind had understood, and his warnings had gone unheard. If there is a lesson to be learned from his life, it is that clarity and courage are not always rewarded, that truth is fragile in systems built to favor delusion, that the cost of ignoring reality is measured not in money or territory, but in human lives. Von Rundstedt's story endures not because he won or lost, but because he represents what is possible when honesty confronts power, and what is lost when that confrontation fails. This concludes the narrative of von Rundstedt's final years, the collapse of Nazi Germany, and the moral lessons his story leaves behind.